So a very good evening to everyone present. So today's class is going to be on cell injury. So this is another series in which we have been doing it from 17th of this month. So today we will be discussing on the topic in pathology, that is cell injury. So I'll just start to share my screen. So yes, so I suppose the screen is visible to everyone. So the cell injury is a very, very important topic in pathology, and microbiology and pathology put together is actually like some 14 questions, which is asked out of 240 questions. So, and cell injury is one such topic which we have been dealing right from our second year, and it is important even as a second year student. So this forms the basis for everything. For any injury which takes place, this forms the basis. So whenever I talk about an injury, the changes takes place at the molecular or the cellular level, right? So this is the entire cell which you can see, and these are all the various organelles, cell organelles, like nucleus, mitochondria, cytoplasm, Golgi bodies, and which forms the part of the cell. So whenever the injury happens over here, there is some kind of an alteration which is taking place in the cellular level. So when I say injury, what actually happens is nothing but some kind of a stimulus. It does not necessarily be harmful. It is some kind of a stimulus. So what actually happens over here is this entire cell is in a physiological state, or the imbalance between the cells is called as homeostasis. Okay, so the physiological state in which there's a balance between the organelles, in which the cell is actually in proper position, in physiological position, is called the homeostasis. So whenever there is an external stimuli which alters this homeostasis, it leads to two kinds of outcome. So that can be either adaptation of the cell with the surrounding stimulus, or it can cause an injury. So based on the threshold and the type of stimulus which is going to be happening, it can be either adaptation or injury. So our main concentration will be on injury for this class. So what actually happens over here in adaptation? So when I talk about adaptation, it is nothing but the stimulus which is happening over there. The cell is trying to adapt it. It is trying to grow along with the stimulus. So what can happen over here is you can have an hyperplasia, increasing in number of cells, or it can be adapting to hyper. Anyone wants to say? So it can be hypertrophy, that is increasing in size. So it can be either size or number, or it can be because, or there is a decrease in size. Okay, so there it can be hypertrophy, hyperplasia, dystrophy, or dysplasia. So dysplasia over here refers to the change in the morphological state, which can lead to something called as malignant malformation. Okay, so this dysplasia is something which we need to deal in a separate way, which is neoplasm transformation, which is actually a form of adaptation and not an injury. Okay, so whenever I talk about adaptation, you have hyperplasia, hypertrophy, dysplasia, and metaplasias. So injury is something different from this. So what actually happens in injury is there is the stimulus which is producing this is causing an alteration in the biochemical nature of the cell. Okay, so the bioprocess is getting damaged, whereas in adaptation, you do not have any such changes. And to some extent, we can say that all these are reversible. Whereas in injury, the process can be either reversible or irreversible. Okay, so when I say about injury, we need to know what kind of stimulus is actually acting upon for us to undergo this kind of changes, right? So it can be broadly classified into two types. That is, one is the genetic, another is the acquired. So genetic causes can be because of any mutation, translocations, and other things which will not be of much interest to us. Whereas acquired is the one which we generally encounter. So acquired can be either because of physical agents, chemical agents, immunological agents, nutritional agents, or toxicity, microbiological toxicity, which can be bacteria, fungus, virus, or aging processes. So these are all the acquired stimulus. Let me repeat. Physical, which can be because of heat, cold. Chemical, which can be because of some harsh environment exposing to some acidic pH, alkali pH imbalances. Or it can be because of some electrical transmissions. Or it can be because of immunological, microbiological changes. So all these stimulus, when they act upon this normal cell, they lead to something called as a cell injury. So what happens in cell injury? It can happen in two ways. So, all right, let me again say reversible cell injury is of less importance because can be reversed. So the maximum thing which is going to happen, the damage is within control and the cell has got the feedback mechanisms to bring it back to the normal state. Whereas irreversible cell injury is something which we need to concern because the cell does not have the capacity to come back to its own physiological state. Therefore, it needs to have some facilitations so that it does not undergo any pathogenic changes after the irreversible cell injury. Because the function of the particular cell is lost, which becomes a huge concern for us when compared to a reversible cell injury where the function can be taken back to its physiological state. So here what happens is you have an unselective injury or selective injury depending upon the type in which the stimulus is taking, or it can, this will damage only your cytoplasm part, this whole thing. Okay, whereas if it is going to repair my DNA, whereas if that is the case, then these are all the findings which I need to look into it. So there can be a necrosis, an apoptosis, a senescence, a dysplasia. So like I said, if there is a damage to the DNA, it can lead to alteration in the architectural part of the cell, which can lead to neoplasm transformation. But whereas the other ones, necrosis, apoptosis, or senescence, senescence is nothing but aging. So here the stimulus itself is going to be some physiological one. Whereas because of old age, there can be formation of some dermis and the skin becomes responsive. So that kind of things happens, or formation of any scales which happens over here. So senescence is not of concern, which is again a physiological process. But apoptosis and necrosis can lead to cell death. Here again, apoptosis is nothing but programmed cell death, which happens because of lot of enzymes known as capacases. So that again will be contributing to mitosis and meiosis condition. But whereas necrosis is something which can be associated with pathology. So what actually happens in the reversible and irreversible cell injury? The ones which I have underlined, please make a note of it. So in reversible cell injury, what basically happens is swelling of this organ or swelling of the cell. Why does a swelling happen? So what is swelling? Swelling is nothing but influx of some kind of a fluid. So there needs to be some kind of an ionic imbalance, right? So when an ionic imbalance takes place, why does it happen? Because the first step which happens over here is nothing but the ATP is actually decreased. So when ATP is decreased, there is an imbalance between the ions. So there is a dysfunction of this pumps. So when there is dysfunction of this pumps, it leads to ER swelling or cell swelling. Or there is membrane, this swelling leads to something called as membrane plebs. So which leads to accumulation of lipids. So this actually happens over here. So what happens? There is an alteration in the ATP function. ATP function alteration leads to dysfunction in the cationic anionic pumps. So when there is a dysfunction of the pump, there is an imbalance in the ion, which leads to swelling, which are called as nothing the membrane plebs. So what happens in an irreversible? There is a dysfunction of the mitochondria, or there is amorphous density forms in the mitochondria. This basically is the pathognomic sign of irreversible cell injury. So then it also leads to formation of ROS, or nothing but the reactive oxygen species. These are nothing but free radicals which goes and acts on the cells and disrupts the cells. So the contents of the cells comes out and leads to cell death. Okay, so if I'm able to stop over here the injury, then it becomes reversible. If it continues, goes beyond, then it leads to cell death. There is no stoppage over here. Okay. So the next thing is, this is just a diagrammatic representation of the cell injuries which is taking place. So what happens over here is the reversible part. So as you can see, like I said, there will be swelling. So there is an increase in the volume of the organ. So this swelling leads to recovery, because once this part, the stimulus is gone, the damage which happens over here, the anionic imbalance is getting replaced. So it comes back to its own position. How? Because the ATPase activity is again being coming into shape. So when the ATPase activity is shaped up, the cation-anion imbalance is again shaped. So it comes to a normal cell. But whereas in irreversible, we have got a lot of other happenings. That is, there is condensation of nuclear, lysosomal rupture, and as you can see over here, the nucleus over here, there is loss of ribosome. So when there is no protein structure inside a nucleus, the formation of or the signaling molecules is getting disrupted, which leads to something called as necrosis or cell death. Okay, so this again is an example where irreversible injury happens. In this irreversible injury, here it happens over here is called the necrosis. Another one is the apoptosis. So necrosis and apoptosis, how is that different? Like I said, apoptosis is something, a programmed cell death. That is a particular cell when there is something called as a concept of cell addition. So whenever two different cells comes in contact, then the biosensors on the surfaces of the cell membrane will tell that you cannot move further. There is someone in your path. So it leads to apoptosis and the cell will die. When this biosensor is lost, it leads to the loss of cell adhesion property, which leads to multiple growth or cancerous neoplastic formations. Whereas in necrosis, there is actually a change in the archaeological part of the cell organelles. So because of that, it leads to different types of necrosis, which can be coagulative or liquefaction, caseous or fat necrosis. So what happens in coagulative necrosis is there is denaturation, hypoxic cell death, but the cell outline is actually preserved. And caseous necrosis, it is actually a type of coagulative necrosis which happens by inflammatory associated with inflammatory conditions. Remember, it is seen in tuberculosis only in the tuberculized cell and not as such in tuberculosis. Okay, and then there's a liquefaction where there's complete digestion of and enzymatic action where there is a focal and bacterial infection being seen. And then you have the fat destruction, fat necrosis, where there is which occurs in the adipose tissue or the cells which contains fat. So as the name suggests, these are all the different types. And you have to remember is this. So coagulative happens in heart, spleen and kidney, whereas liquefaction happens in brain or abscess. Fat necrosis, the ones where, like I said, which has got a lot of adipose tissue, it could be pancreas or breast. And then in fibrinoid necrosis, it can happen in peptic ulcers or arterioles in hypertensive cases. And then you have caseous necrosis, which happens only in the tuberculous infection. Okay, in center of the tuberculous infection. So with this we stop the class. That is, we have talked about how the cell injury happens and how necrosis and apoptosis and other things happen. So we'll move on to the MCQs. So the first one is, like I said, most pathognomic sign of irreversible cell injury. So what could be the answer? Anyone wants to say? So it is actually the amorphous. Oh yes. So it is actually a dysfunction, which is the amorphous densities in the mitochondria. So the next question. So liquefaction necrosis, which is straight question, is seen in. I thought this will be easy for everyone to answer. It is seen in brains. Okay. And the next one is a little tricky one because a coagulative necrosis is found in which infection? It is actually seen in TB. Like I said, caseous necrosis is the one which is associated with TB, but the caseous necrosis is seen only in the tuberculized part of the cell. So TB as such is something which is related to an organ. So the organ over here affected is lung. So the lung has got a coagulative necrosis, whole lung, and the part in which the presence of tubercular organism is present, the cells, the cells with the parenchymal cells present in the lung will exhibit caseous necrosis. So yes, caspases are seen in which condition? So they are seen most commonly in apoptosis. Okay. And last one, apoptosis is what? How do you say apoptosis is? We all know it is nothing but programmed cell death. But among this, the best option which you can select is a type of cell injury. Like we discussed, whenever we talk about cell injury happens, it can be reversible and irreversible. Reversible is something which comes back to its physiological state, so we need not worry. So in irreversible cell injury, what are all the outcomes? It can be either necrosis, apoptosis, senescence, or dysplasia. Dysplasia is something which we need to talk in neoplastic transformation. But whereas the other three is what we discussed today. So cell injury is a very, very important topic which forms the basis for any pathology. So for us to understand, these are all the terminologies in which you need to know and the possible areas where questions can be asked. So if you have any doubts, please ask me now. or you can even post it in the chat box. Okay, if there are no questions, because this is a very simple topic and the questions are also very easy, we can wrap up the session. So I think there are no questions. So I think we can wrap up the session. So yeah, thank you everyone for your spending your time, and thank you for the opportunity.